welcome again to another edition of Christian Answers for Today. I'm Pastor Jeff Short, and today's topic will be a topic that I have talked about over the last few years, not on this television program, but in other events and at other gatherings, and it is the Boy Scouts of America. I was once a Boy Scout many, many years ago, and I enjoyed my time in Boy Scouting. I did not achieve the Eagle Scout, but I got up to a Star Scout, and I went to many, many campouts, and I was a part of the Order of the Arrow fraternity, and I was also part of many other different events, the Mile Swim Club, and all kinds of other things. So I had a great time in the Boy Scouts. It saddens me to learn that the Boy Scouts are lowering their standards very, very low these days. Starting last year, when the Boy Scouts of America as an organization decided to allow openly homosexual boys into the scouting, which was a disappointment because the scouting had always maintained high ethical and moral standards. And so when you allow openly gay Boy Scouts into Boy Scouting, you are lowering the moral standards. That's obvious. So I was not happy with that, and I was understanding why many of the Boy Scouts had left the Boy Scouts last year, and some of the different sponsoring churches pulled out of the Boy Scouts in order to form their own scouting units. Well, this year there is another decline in the Boy Scouts, and that comes with the president of the Boy Scouts this year, Robert Gates. Now, Robert Gates was a high-level administration official in a couple of administrations, and he's supposed to be one of our top leaders in our country. But when you look at what he is doing to the Boy Scouts of America, you will find out that he is not a good leader. He does not have good leadership qualities, and you can see that already in his speech that he recently gave to the Boy Scouts of America at their national annual meeting just a couple weeks ago. And he gave a speech where at the very end of his speech, he began to outline his vision for allowing openly gay scout leaders to participate in the Boy Scouts. We're not talking about openly gay Boy Scouts. That's bad enough. But now Robert Gates is now saying that the Boy Scouts have to open their ranks to the openly homosexual scout leader and also other volunteer leaders. So he has gone from bad to worse, and he's only been in office 1 year. Now, I was reviewing the last 4 or 5 minutes of his speech, and we're going to do that today. And we're going to pick up at about the 9-minute mark, and we're going to comment on this. So let's roll that tape, and let's see what Robert Gates has to say, and then make some commentary to it.
I told you a year ago that I would oppose reopening this issue during my 2-year term as president of the BSA. I had hoped then for a respite, during which we could focus on healing our divisions from the 2013 decision, improving our program, strengthening our finances, and ending our decline in membership. However, events during the past year have confronted us with urgent challenge I did not foresee last year and which we cannot ignore.
And as you can see, Robert Gates appears to be overly concerned about the administrative statistics of Boy Scouts of America. He seems to be overly concerned about the number of boys in Boy Scouts. He seems to be overly concerned about the number of troops in Boy Scouts. He seems to be overly concerned about the financial numbers. In other words, he seems to be a manager rather than a leader. He seems to be a bean counter rather than a role model. And so he's trying to be this administrator, and he's trying to turn around a corporation like he would in the profit-making world, and he doesn't seem to be caring much about the core values of the Boy Scouts. And so from my impression of what he's saying, he seems to be almost a slave to numbers, and he seems to be a bureaucrat rather than a leader. And so that's very disappointing to see a leader of Boy Scouts who is more of a managerial type than a leadership type. And he talks about him wanting to not deal with this whole issue during the first year of his leadership, and his second year of leadership. But here again, he's dealing with the issue, so he's basically reneged on his promise to not go over this ground again. And he says it's necessary for the different realities that have presented themselves this year, but I think that's just an excuse. I think he's worried about the numbers, and he's worried about the administrative statistics of the Boy Scouts instead of worrying about keeping them faithful to their core vision. So let's play some more of this clip and see what he has to say.
We cannot ignore growing internal challenges to our current membership policy from some councils, like the Greater New York Council, the Denver Area Council, and others, in open defiance of the policy, to more and more councils taking a position in their mission statements and public documents contrary to national policy. Nor can we ignore the social, political, and juridical changes taking place in our country, changes taking place at a pace over this past year that no one anticipated. I remind you of the recent debates we have seen in Indiana, in Arkansas, and elsewhere over discrimination based on sexual orientation, not to mention the impending U.S. Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. I'm not asking the National Board for any action to change our current policy at this meeting, but I must speak as plainly and as bluntly to you as I spoke to presidents when I was Director of CIA and Secretary of Defense. We must deal with the world as it is, not as we might wish it would be. The status quo in our movement's membership standards cannot be sustained. We can expect more councils to openly challenge the current policy. While technically we have the authority to revoke their charters, such an action would deny the lifelong benefits of scouting to hundreds of thousands of boys and young men today, and vastly more in the future. I will not take that path. Moreover, dozens of states, from New York to Utah, are passing laws that protect employment rights on the basis of sexual orientation. Thus, between internal challenges and potential legal conflicts, the BSA finds itself in an unsustainable position, a position that makes us vulnerable to the possibility the courts will simply order us at some point to change our membership policy. We must all understand that this probably will happen sooner rather than later. In 2010, a single federal district judge in California overturned the military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell law, and the reversal was applied nationwide immediately. Only a stay granted by the appeals court, granted I believe mainly because we were in the process of changing the law, prevented dramatic disruption of the armed forces. We cannot predict if or when this might happen to us, but I personally believe our legal defenses have weakened since the Dale case. And if we wait for the courts to act, we could end up with a broad ruling that could forbid any kind of membership standard, including our foundational belief in our duty to God and our focus on serving the specific needs of boys. Waiting for the courts is a gamble with huge stakes. Alternatively, we can move at some future date, but sooner rather than later, to seize control of our own future, to set our own course, and change our policy in order to allow charter partners, unit-sponsoring organizations, to determine the standards for their scout leaders. Such an approach would allow all churches, which sponsor some 70% of our scout units, to establish leadership standards consistent with their faith. We must, at all costs, preserve the religious freedom of our church partners to do this. Our oath calls upon us to do our duty to God and to our country. The country is changing, and we are increasingly at odds with the legal landscape at both the state and federal levels. And as a movement, we find ourselves with a policy that more than a few of our church sponsors reject, thus placing scouting between a boy and his church.
Now, on this point, it's really, really sad to see him talking the way he's talking about. He's referring to, by making this comment, he's referring to some of the churches in the far left or radical liberal wing of Protestantism, and he's saying that some of those churches are not comfortable with the present Boy Scout policy because it bans openly gay and homosexual scoutmasters. And these liberal, radical, left-wing churches would rather have Boy Scouts open all the ranks of leadership to gay and homosexual men. And so he's saying that makes it hard for these left-wing, radical, liberal churches to, in good conscience, sponsor Boy Scout troops, and it makes it hard for the boys who are part of these churches to actually be in the Boy Scouts because their church teaches that gays should be in leadership positions in the Boy Scouts, and the Boy Scouts' present policy teaches that they shouldn't be, so he's worried about these boys. Rather than worry about those boys in those few churches, what he should be worried about is the vast more churches that actually are acceptable and tolerant of the National Boy Scout policy that bans gays in leadership positions and are happy with that. They're not so happy with the actual allowing for open homosexual Boy Scouts to be in, but they're tolerating that. What he should be worried about is those churches that if they change their present ban against gay leadership, those churches will leave and those boys will leave. So that's the real worry he should have, not about the radical left-wing liberal churches that want openly homosexual scoutmasters. He should be worrying about the majority of churches who don't want that, and if he changes that policy to allow them, they will leave. So he not only is wrong about emphasizing society's morality over God, he's wrong about emphasizing the radical left wing rather than the mainstream middle or the right wing. So he needs to get his priorities right. He is way, way off.
The challenges are before us now. The Executive Committee, the National Executive Board, and our legal counsel will work to determine our responses and our best strategy. We welcome and value your thoughts in all of this, recognizing the importance of protecting our core values.
Now, when he talks about protecting the core values of the Boy Scouts, he's not really talking about the core values of the Boy Scouts. He's talking about the general, basic direction of the Boy Scouts over the 100 years or so that they've existed. He's not talking about the specific core values, because if he's talking about specific core values, they've already demolished a core value by opening up the Boy Scouts to openly gay scouts. And now he's wanting to demolish another core moral value, character value of the Boy Scouts, and that is open the Boy Scout leadership up to openly gay scoutmasters. He's already advocating for the destruction of their core values in these things. And so when he talks about the core values of the Boy Scouts, he's talking about the ones that he hasn't thrown out yet. He's talking about the few ones that are just left and calling them the core values. Well, those are the core values, but they're getting kind of small now because people like him keep throwing them out every other year or so when the pressure is there to do so. So don't be taken in by his rhetoric about the core values. He's wanting to throw them out.
The one thing we cannot do is put our heads in the sand and pretend that this challenge will go away or abate. Quite the opposite is happening. I suspect my remarks on this subject unsettle some of you. Some of you might be angry that I raised this subject and with what I've said.
Well, that's an understatement for many of the parents that are hearing him talk, and many of the leaders, and many of the boys, because what he's basically doing is selling out the Boy Scouts, and it's only his first anniversary of leadership in the Boy Scouts, and he's already willing to sell out the Boy Scouts. Now, he says he was a Boy Scout once. I was a Boy Scout once, and I can tell you this man is selling out the Boy Scouts, and he is doing so out of political expedience. He is a politician. He worked in at least two administrations. He's used to compromising. He's used to negotiation. He's used to the political world. Now, you can do that on non-moral issues. You can do that on non-core issues. But he comes into the Boy Scouts, and now he's wanting to deal and negotiate away the core values of the Boy Scouts, especially the character and moral values of the Boy Scouts, and he's acting like a politician. He's acting like a bureaucrat when he actually should be standing strong and being a leader and facing the challenges and not backing down. When you surrender, you're backing down. And that's what Robert Gates is advocating the Boy Scouts do.
But this movement shaped my life, and my only purpose, my only reason for assuming this leadership role is to preserve the Boy Scouts of America in recognition of all it has done for this country and all it can and must do in the future.
When he says that he is wanting to save the Boy Scouts of America, this is the same kind of language that we heard in the 19th century by the liberal churches in the early part of the 19th century, or the 20th century, the 1900s. We heard this, the rationale or the excuse of selling out the Protestant churches, the mainline Protestant churches, to liberalism. And liberalism is basically watering down Christianity to the point where there's no incompatibility and no tension with the culture. See, the culture is always changing. It's going up and down and sideways. And the church is supposed to be standing firm in a changing culture. Well, that makes problems for the church, and it's a lot easier to go along and ride down that stream with the culture. And liberal churches, especially liberal Protestant churches in the 20th century, struck a deal with the culture and said, okay, we will not contradict your words, and we will blend in with you and be totally compatible with you in order to save Christianity from destruction. We're afraid, we're fearful that if we don't change and cave in and capitulate and surrender, that we will be destroyed. And so we will surrender our doctrines and our beliefs and our truths to the academic world. We will surrender our doctrine of creation and all that to the scientific world. We will surrender our beliefs about the atonement and spiritual truths to the sociologists and psychologists, and on and on and on. And so in order to save Christianity, we will surrender it to the culture. That's what the liberals did. Well, we're hearing the same talk of surrender by Robert Gates, and he's saying in the name of saving the Boy Scouts, he actually has to surrender their values to the culture, or else the culture will simply run over us as Boy Scouts, and we will be nothing. And so in order to save us, we have to surrender some important truths and values in order to stay alive. And so that's what he's trying to advocate that the Boy Scouts do, surrender to stay alive.
Scouting is needed in America today more than ever. I assure you I have no hidden agenda. I want only to apprise you of the new reality that I see, that both internal and external events and pressures over the past year and looking to the future will require action at some point. For now, I ask that in the days and months ahead, everyone here reflect and pray on our path forward. We can act on our own, or we can be forced to act. But either way, I suspect we don't have a lot of time.
Again, we hear this language of urgency that if we don't hold up the white flag, if we don't surrender to the prevailing cultural winds, we will simply be crushed and destroyed, and they will take everything away from us, and they will take control, and the courts will set the membership standards, the courts will set the policy standards for our organizations. So unless we step in and do what they want us to do, they will take complete control. So we need to surrender some of these core values so that we at least maintain some control over our destiny, because if we don't, the courts... Again, this is weakness. This is the weakness language. This is a capitulation language. This is a hold up the white flag language. This is poor leadership. In fact, this is not leadership. This is bean counting management. This is bureaucracy. This is sniveling, wimpy, Casper milquetoast business that is not even good business management, because you don't surrender yourself servilely to the customer. You meet the needs of the customer, you service the customer, but you don't give yourself over to them and be bullied by them. And that's what's happening here. We're having Robert Gates look at the culture, seeing that it's changing, seeing that gay marriage, he's seeing that the courts are ruling against traditional marriage and against Christian morality, and he's advocating surrender and capitulation. And this is a terrible role model for boys. This is a terrible role model for character and leadership. This is subservience, and this is not the way we want boys to act when they're faced with challenges.
For me, I support a policy that accepts and respects our different perspectives and beliefs, allows religious organizations based on their First Amendment protections of religious freedom to establish their own standards for adult leaders, and preserves the Boy Scouts of America now and forever. I truly fear that any other alternative will be the end of us as a national movement.
Again, he's talking about fear. He's talking about anxiety. He's talking about his worry that the Boy Scouts will gradually die out if they don't make these changes, and that society will leave them behind. But you have to ask yourself, if you have to surrender your moral standards, if you have to surrender your core values as an organization, for example, if you're a church and you have to surrender your moral values, your doctrines, your lifestyle, all the things that make you distinctively a Christian church, if you have to surrender all of them to exist, what's the point of existing? And if you as a Boy Scout organization have to surrender your character building core values to exist as a boys organization, what's the point of existing as a boys organization? It's supposed to be countercultural. You're supposed to be leading boys into a higher position of character than the culture teaches them. If you're going to simply capitulate to the culture, you don't need the Boy Scouts of America as a group and as an organization to join. If you're going to capitulate and lower yourself and dumb down your morality and your character building to match that of the culture, you don't need a Boy Scout organization. You just go ahead and swim in the mainstream culture, and you're going to be formed character-wise, and you're going to be formed morality-wise, or lack thereof. And you don't need a big organization that meets every week and boys doing activities. You just simply blend into your culture, and you're going to be enculturated. And that's what he's trying to bring into the Boy Scouts. He's trying to bring the wider immoral cultural standards, the ones that have been lowered, he's trying to bring those into the Boy Scouts and lower the Boy Scout standards. And this totally doesn't make sense. It totally doesn't make sense. Now, what he's advocating is that each troop has the freedom to basically decide who they want to be as a troop. Do they want to affirm openly gay scout leaders, or do they want to reject them? Well, they should all have the freedom. Well, that's not a standard for boys. That's not a Boy Scout standard. You don't have your core values up for grabs every little group that opens up in the country. You have a standard and you hold to it. And you teach boys and you teach leaders why there's a standard there. You explain in rational terms, and you give them all of the arguments why these standards should be held, and then you hold to them, come thick or thin. You don't capitulate. Capitulating is a bad role model. You don't want to teach boys that when the going gets tough, you just give up. That's what Robert Gates is saying. When the pressure comes and it gets hot and heavy and the heat's turned up, what you do is you just capitulate. You surrender. You do whatever the higher power is telling you to do in the government or society, instead of holding fast to your core values. That's what he's saying. And that is a rotten, rotten example of leadership. I think they need to remove this man before he does any more damage.
Every day, in every community in America, Scouting is changing the lives of boys and young men, teaching them skills and leadership, helping them build character and integrity.
The Boy Scouts, if they do what he says to do, will not be teaching character and integrity. because part of character, part of the definition of character involves a moral standard. Part of the whole definition of integrity is to be able to hold to these absolute moral principles. And if you're going to deal these principles off, negotiate them away, capitulate to the cultural lowering of the moral standards, that is not character building. That is not integrity. That is less than character building. Sure, the boys can learn how to tie knots, put up pup tents, build a fire, do all kinds of survival skills, but they are not going to learn how to stand strong, stand against the crowd, not follow the crowd, not always follow the popular will. They're not learning how to be strong men that they'll need to be in the future. Instead, they're learning to be cowards and cowardly in the face of challenges. And Robert Gates, unfortunately, is leading them into that cowardly direction.
Every day, in every community, Scouting makes those communities a better place to live. We have been doing this for 105 years. I'm confident we will do so for another 105, as long as we stand together, united in our singular mission to serve American youth. I'm honored to work with all of you to give our young people the wisdom, the direction, and the confidence to be the best they can be. Thank you.
We've just heard from Robert Gates, and he's concluded his remarks at the Boy Scouts annual meeting, and we've seen and analyzed what he said, and now we have to reflect on what he said further and just pray that what he has advocated, his capitulation to the declining culture, is not implemented. We need to pray that the top leadership decision makers vote against his proposal. And actually, we need to, I think it would be appropriate to pray that he is actually removed or someone else steps up to become president of the Boy Scouts of America, because this man obviously is willing to basically throw away the core values of scouting in order to somehow be current and hip and cool and relevant in his eyes. And he thinks that is the way to save the Boy Scouts. Well, that is the way to destroy the Boy Scouts, because you are going to see a mass exodus from the Boy Scouts like we haven't seen before. When they opened up the Boy Scouts to openly gay scouts, there was an exodus of thousands and thousands of boys and hundreds of troops. And now you're going to see an even bigger mass exodus once they open up the Boy Scouts to openly gay scout leaders. Because these churches that sponsor the scouts, these parents and the boys who are part of these Bible-believing Christian churches, they're not going to put up with that. Who wants to go to a camp when you have an openly gay scoutmaster who you're going to have to be sleeping in the same tent with, and knowing that this guy is attracted to boys and men rather than girls? You're not going to have parents want to put their boys in that risky situation. You're not going to have boys feel comfortable in that, and you're certainly not going to recruit other men to be part of this organization where they have these lowered moral standards. So we need to pray for the Boy Scouts, and we need to think twice about letting our boys join any Boy Scout movement that would open up the ranks to leadership of openly gay men. Well, I hope that that's helped inform you today to help you make better decisions about people that you care about. And we'll see you back here next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.